One of the biggest killers of training momentum and training consistency is technique drift. Technique drift is when you're drifting away from your usual or ideal technique. Now, there's nothing like perfect technique for anyone, but if you take a look at some of the best lifters on the planet, they have had very consistent technique throughout the years. If you take a look at somebody like Austin Perkins, his squat has looked the exact same for the longest time that I can think of, right? And not just squat, but bench and deadlift as well. So that's just one example of one of the best lifters on the planet who does it, so consistently. One big misconception of people is that they think that training consistency is what leads to results. It doesn't guarantee results, because if you're somebody who's showing up at the gym 5 times a week and you're trying to hammer in things as much as you possibly can, but then you're making changes to your technique every single session, then there's no consistency. There's no real consistency. I'm not saying that you shouldn't show up at the gym consistently, but every single time you show up at the gym, you want to make sure that those sessions count, right? So you want to make sure that your technique is going as well as it possibly can, because then all you need to focus on is just making progress. All you can think of from there is spacing block and making changes to block, and then just focusing on the comp lifts as well as you possibly can, right? Because if you're consistently focusing on, oh, this is feeling off or that is feeling off, then you're going to struggle a little bit. You're still going to have sessions like that even if your technique is dialed in, but that's the reason why technique needs to be consistent. Now, technique drift can happen for voluntary reasons or involuntary reasons. Voluntary reasons are pretty straightforward. If you and your coach find problems with your squat, bench, or deadlift, or any other lift for that reason, they will suggest what you need to change. They will tell you what you need to improve on, and then you give feedback to them, and then you make changes to the technique. And over time, you're going to dial in that new technique, and you're going to feel better, right? Uh, the other problem that I can see with voluntary technique changes is when you make the change on your own, but then you don't consult your coach, which is why it's very important to be on the same page as your coach, where you and your coach are in sync with the changes that you're making, so that you both can understand what needs to be changed, what doesn't need to be changed. Involuntary reasons can happen for multiple things, like multiple reasons, right? Involuntary technique change or technique drifts can happen for multiple reasons, such as sleep, fatigue, food changes, or even if you fall sick, etc., etc. I'm going to go by some of the things that I can think of, which are, and then try to explain to you where and how. So if your sleep is off, you're going to have a lot of problem with recovering. And if your recovery is off as a result of sleep being bad, then you're going to have achy joints, achy connective tissue, which means that you can't get into positions that you usually do, and that's why you might make changes in technique for those sessions, because your sleep has been off, because you're not able to get into the positions that you usually do. So that can lead to one drift away from technique where your usual technique is supposed to be, and then you make these changes as a result of not wanting to change technique, but it can happen on its own, right? Two, if your food is off, you might feel extra bloated, you might feel extra bloated, you might feel gassy, you might feel off, and due to that, that changes leverage. So the simplest way I can tell you is, if you've eaten something very weird that doesn't suit you, you might have a situation where, for example, you might feel very bloated, you might feel very gassy, and then something like on deadlift, if you're, especially if you're a conventional deadlifter, you might not be able to wedge yourself into position because your stomach and your thighs are pushing against each other and you can't brace as well. So that is when your technique starts to change again. You might have higher hips than usual, you might be pulling too much with the back than usual, and you're not able to get too much of legs involved, and you're not able to get that leg drive that you're looking for. Three, which is changes in your leverage, which is again related to food. If you're somebody who is making changes to your food drastically, which you should never do, in my opinion, or in most cases, at least for powerlifting, you shouldn't. Uh, what that means is that if you're somebody who's doing an extremely fast cut or an extremely fast bulk, in both cases, you're actually making changes to leverages. Leverages are not just the limb lengths, but also how much space there is for you to move in. So it's quite simple. Again, like the last point, if you're somebody who has bulked up too fast, you're going to feel like you need to go wider on your squats or your deadlifts, and that can start to feel a little off because you're not used to that yet. So I'm not saying that those like you shouldn't bulk or you shouldn't cut, but whenever you're doing it, it has to be well planned so that you can ease into any kind of technique changes that are required, right? Now, if you fall sick, let's say you've fallen sick, you've lost a lot of weight, and you're feeling very weak, your joints are aching. This is basically, all of them put together. Again, you're going to feel that's a temporary problem. You shouldn't panic. You should just let things run its course, keep the RP low, just get back to training, and you're going to feel fine after a while. Um, the next point is, if you have too much problem with your training volume or intensity. If you're somebody who is consistently pushing too hard and too much, then you're going to have problems with the recovery, regardless of whether sleep, food, and everything else is on point, right? So that's when you need to make sure that you need actual programming changes, because you can't always take deloads multiple times, because then you're going to have problems with stimulus, and if you don't have enough training stimulus, you're not going to grow, right? So for even if you're taking care of every single thing, all recovery parameters, due to fatigue being too high, it can cause technical changes to happen even when you don't want to. So it's very similar to the first point that I made, is that if your sleep is off, you're going to feel achy and you're going to feel difficult to get into your usual positions. So if you can't get into usual positions, then what will happen? You'll try to change your technique in order to get into positions, right? So that's where the technical drift can happen. Now, if you take a look at all the things that I've said, right, one of the biggest reasons for why training momentum and training consistency is affected is a result of all of these things, right? That's the reason why when we talk about powerlifting, coaches will consistently talk about how you need to take care of your sleep, your food, and obviously don't fall sick. That's just general for anything. And you don't want to bulk too fast, you don't want to cut too fast. You want to make sure your recovery parameters are on point, and along with that, you're making sure that you're showing up and executing the way you want to show up, so that you can have the progress that you need to make in order to win the next competition that you want to do, right? Like a lot of people make these mistakes where they're showing up, the training, but then the technique is consistently changing, so there's actually no real consistency. So that's the reason why you don't want to make these kind of mistakes. If you think about it, you might be training for a whole year, but if every single session your training is off, you're feeling off, and you're making mistakes like this, then of course you're not going to be able to make progress, because there's the only thing that's constant is change. There is no actual constant technique, right? So I'll give you an example of how much this actually matters. At least this is my experience and my understanding of the matter, and how I've seen things over the last 8 years. So I had a lifter come up to me, and this is a common scenario. This is not just one lifter, but I'm just giving you one lifter's example so you have an understanding of how much this can actually affect things. Okay, so I had a person come to me. They came to me with like a 250 260 kg deadlift, and with initial assessments, I found out there were some things that we could change with respect to technique and programming. So we made those changes, and once technique clicked, all I wanted that person to do was just follow the loads prescribed or the RP prescribed, so that they can make consistent progress. Now, 3 blocks to 4 blocks in with me, this person went from 250 to 260 kg deadlift to repping 300 for 3 with like another rep or 2 in the tank. Okay, that's major progress. Now, usually what happens is when a lifter comes to this point, they kind of feel like they need to make some changes. Like there's this insect in their head that keeps saying like, it's fast, it can be faster, it has to be faster. I need to make even more progress. So then they start making technique changes, which then starts to make them regress, right? So this person then went on to make unnecessary technical changes, and these technical changes also don't show up in just one session. Like you're making a few changes and things are moving fine initially, and then over a course of time, like over a period of like 3 to 4 weeks, then you start noticing, like as a coach, you start noticing that, yeah, something has changed here. I don't know what it is, but something has changed here. So we need to go back to what was working. Now, there is a very usual problem that I see, which is a huge problem, is that when things are going really well, If you take them for granted and then you start thinking like, I'm going to make this technique change that's not required, you're going to actually forget how you were able to get the right technique before that. So if your technique was really good and you were doing well, and then you make changes to technique, the usual problem is that you're going to find that it's very difficult for you to get back to the technique that was actually working. Which is why I keep telling people that when something is going really well, do not let go of it, do not take it for granted, because if you take it for granted, you're going to lose it, and then it's going to take months or maybe even years for you to start feeling that way again. I've seen that happen to the best of the lifters. That's the reason why you don't want to make technique changes that are unnecessary. So this person went from 250 to 60 kg deadlift to a 300 for reps with more left in the tank after 3 to 4 blocks. And then after making changes, they started struggling again for a 270 to 80 kg single. So that tells you how much of a massive difference it makes with respect to how much technique consistency plays a role. If your technique is consistent and your technique is well suited or ideal to you, you do not have to make changes unless and until your coach is seeing something that there's something wrong. So I hope that helps. I hope that's a video that helps you understand how much of a massive difference it makes, because this is something that I see very, very commonly. A lot of people make this mistake, and if you want to train for a long period of time and continue to make progress, then this is one factor that I feel makes a massive difference in how well you're able to show up and show out.